changes in good times. Why would you? We only change in bad times. Well, these are some bad times. These are some challenging times. So it's time for some radical transformational change.
Once the protests die off, the problem is still going to be here. So we need to make a significant commitment, both in the short term and in the medium and long term, for us to help reduce the racial wealth gap that has existed and has not closed at all since the 1960s, since the last civil rights movement.
All of us CEOs have large African-American employee bodies that we owe it to them to make sure that we're speaking to this and that we're asking our policymakers to step up, that we're asking our political leaders to step up and recognize and just say it, we got a problem. We have a big problem and it needs to be dealt with.
What must we do? Hold ourselves accountable in corporate America. Set targets like we set targets on everything else. Incentivize people. You get what you incent. Be very clear and very bold about what the expectations are. And if we do that like we do everything else, I mean, corporate America is run by all-stars. They are used to winning. If we do that like we do everything else, we would see this needle move.
You have to believe that a diverse organization that reflects the consumers who we're serving, you have to believe that that diverse organization is going to outcompete a homogenous organization every day. And so this is a business imperative as much as it is us doing the right thing.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to CNBC's Inclusion in Action Forum. Today, we're going to explore the workplace challenges facing people of color, specifically Black Americans, in every field and at all levels of employment. We'll uncover ways business leaders can take immediate, concrete steps to address disparities in their organizations and ways that can ultimately boost their bottom line.
Hi, everybody, and hi, John. It's good to be here with you. Today we're bringing about a conversation about perspectives from various leaders on sustainable and systemic change. We want to explore the role of business in ensuring a more diverse, a more equitable, and a more inclusive economy going forward. And today's event is programmed in part with the Executive Leadership Council. We're proud to team up with them to find practical solutions, actions that can be taken that organizations can do right now. And we welcome Crystal Ashby, who's the interim CEO of the ELC. Crystal, so glad you're with us.
So good to be here. Thanks for having us.
I want to ask you about, given the unique challenges that African Americans and Blacks are facing in the workforce, what is the role of the CEO in ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is that where it has to start?
It definitely has to start at the top of the house. The CEO is the person who's going to establish the culture in the organization, is going to set the values that the organization is going to live by, and is going to mirror those things down through their leadership team, their C-suite, into their mid-level management, into their pipeline. They have to give this the same level as they do every other business priority. It is critical for them to not just speak about it, but to actually be living it and to be showing it, and so that their staff understands this is how we're going to be as an organization. It's critical. If the top of the house isn't engaged in it, it's not going to happen. The reality is what gets measured gets done, and if the CEO is saying that it is critical from their perspective, and not just diversity and inclusion, but this is really more about culture. If they're talking about making sure that the culture of the organization is one where everyone feels that they are equally valuable, and they are talking that talk, that's the most critical thing that can happen.
What role does the ELC play, and has it played, in making sure that this happens? What kind of criteria have you come up with, research you've done, to help CEOs figure this out?
The ELC is actively engaged with our member companies, and we believe that we provide an opportunity for them, a safe space for them to have conversations about the critical issues that they're facing. We provide an opportunity for them to engage and come together with each other. We have had a Juneteenth convening. We brought them together to share with them the playbook called CEOs Combat Systemic Racism, a Framework for Success. We have a Game Changers event coming up in October where we bring them together again to talk about best practices, what's working, what's not. But the critical role that ELC plays is not just a convener, but to be a trusted advocate with them for this journey that they're on. We recognize that change is not something that happens overnight, and that to be an ally with them in how they go on the journey and how they make sure that their organization moves from where it is to where they want it to be. And we recognize that that journey is one that's going to take work, and we're happy to put the work in with them. The book, The CEO's Combat for Systemic Racism, A Framework for Success, was something that we shared with them so that they could understand what some of the steps were that they could take to actively engage and allow their organizations to flourish in these very difficult times. Critical things like disaggregation of the data, and actually really looking at the data, letting the data inform their strategy, understanding what their numbers really look like, being very intentional, understanding that if we're going to change the outcome, we have to be very intentional about the actions, establishing the opportunity to continue to have difficult conversations, creating performance metrics and being very transparent about those, creating talent protocols for their Black talent so that they get mentorship, they get sponsorship, they have an opportunity to get stretch roles, have P&L assignments so that they can be evaluated appropriately for C-suite roles, to be on the succession plan of the CEO, to be available for board seats when they move forward, to create a protocol that everyone is aware is there and allows them to have success and to be viewed as the same as their peers when those opportunities present themselves. It's transparency. It's letting the board know that this exists and that this is the plan forward and this is what we're trying to achieve. It's transparency to their external stakeholders. And most importantly, it's transparency to their Black talent that's inside their organization.
John?
All right. Well, thank you. Coming up, we've got a panel on race and gender and the unique challenges faced by Black women today, and that's going to feature Google's Benita Stewart, Erica Irish Brown from Goldman Sachs, and UWG CEO Monique Nelson. Later, Andrew Ross Sorkin is going to speak with some young executives who are inspiring the next generation of Black business leaders in the fields of technology, sports, and finance. And it's not just business leaders who are calling for change. As Cerevel chairman and CEO Tony Coles told me goodness, what was it? It's just zipping by. Tuesday night, consumers are demanding reform and looking for the business community to take a stand.
Just after the George Floyd murders, done by Edelman, the public relations firm. And that survey actually suggested that 60% of Americans are actually expecting corporations to step up, to take a stand against racial injustice, and actually to have a clear point of view and to hold their employees and themselves accountable. So in this moment, when there is an absolute vacuum in leadership, corporate America and its leaders have to stand in that gap and have to make compelling points and have to be on the vanguard for these things, not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, and not just because it's a corporate stewardship moment, but it's because our customers are expecting that of us. 60% of those surveyed said they will walk away from a brand and boycott it if they don't stand up and respond to the recent national conversation surrounding George Floyd's death. And what's quite interesting is that nearly 70% of individuals 35 and older believe it's a moral obligation of corporate America to do so. So there's some data where our consumers are actually talking to us and expecting us to stand in this gap. And I think that's compelling, and we should listen to that.
You know, this is a very unique moment in our history where business leaders are speaking out, business leaders are supporting actions to promote racial justice. But how can they actually turn this moment into meaningful and lasting change? Let's ask Arnold Donald, the CEO of Carnival, as well as Shanjon Thomas, who is the president of Northern Trust Asset Management, and Caroline Wanga, who is the interim CEO
I'm
at
need
Essence.
cues on stuff like that,
Thank you all for being here. I really want to start with you, Arnold, about the issue of telling your story. You know, there have been a lot of CEOs that have made pronouncements, talked about what their companies have done or should do, and saying that they're going to take action. But what really resonates with many people is when a leader brings in a personal story. And in this case, when we're talking about the death of George Floyd, when we're talking about Breonna Taylor, when we're talking about Jacob Blake, bringing in personal experiences as a Black CEO has a very important role in communicating what your message is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose in June to tell a very personal story in an op-ed in the Miami Herald?
You know, I didn't write that for the Herald. It just kind of got printed there, but it was really written to my employees. And I hesitated to write anything because, you know, people talked about this at that moment as if this was the first time in history that people were coming together to address, you know, racial and social injustice. And obviously I was born prior to the 60s. I lived through the civil rights where we walked arm in arm. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John F. Kennedy, and so on and so forth. Then again in the 80s, there was another round here in the U.S. And so I was hesitant to write anything at all because I thought action would be far more powerful than just talking. But my people needed to hear something, and so I just shared the personal story of growing up in a segregated South and a number of the injustices that happened to me, and then the personal conflicts, not conflicts, but the personal complexity that I live in my life. You know, I have a family member who is often profiled by police officers, so we make certain someone that is living with bipolar disorder. And so I make certain that we introduce them to police officers wherever the individual resides so they know him as a complete person. But I also have two nephews that are police officers. One's Deputy Chief of Police in Washington, D.C., and his brother is in Internal Affairs in a different police force in the Tri-region area there. And so both sides of that comes out in terms of I don't want them taking unnecessary risks and therefore putting their life at risk. But I also don't want the other family member to be misinterpreted and harmed or worse, you know, from a simple misunderstanding and a lack of recognition that the person is living with bipolar disorder. And so, you know, those are just some of the personal things I shared to reflect on the complexity, but the history. And myself, and I just share personal stories with other executives at the appropriate time just to sensitize people. And that's it in a nutshell. But, you know, I'm not unique. Anyone born during the time I was born, I was raised in the Deep South. I had separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, a lot of incidents, a lot of times profiled myself, you know, guns held to my head and so on and so forth when just walking through a neighborhood. And those things were real, and they've been around for a long time. And they at times get better, at times get worse. But together, if we really all stand together and we really, with intention, intervene, we provide the right screening for police officers, the right training, the right reinforcing behaviors, not only how to handle the stressful situations they often find themselves in, but how when you see one of your fellow officers losing it or about to do something that isn't consistent with, you know, good police practice, you know, what's your role in that, and how do you help that person help themselves? So that's on the social justice side in that aspect. But the bigger one is the opportunity side. And,
yep. When you're talking about, Arnold, when you're talking about your personal story.
Yes.
Sorry, Arnold. I just want to say, when you're talking about your personal story, and you're talking about the role that plays, I know Chandran has done the same thing in terms of telling his personal story, whether it's on LinkedIn or in another forum, and sharing that not only with the public or with the business community, but with the executive team, with the corporate board members as well. And Chandran, why is that so important to say after Jacob Blake, I can't feel my pain, to then bring that to the table, not only in the C-suite, but also to the board?
Yeah, I think it's really important because when you think about what we're experiencing, especially when you come into the corporate world, one of the things is people are very detached from the experience. So there's an intellectual understanding, but not necessarily an empathetic understanding. So being able to connect. And so I felt it very important that for those of us who feel so moved to share the perspective, so two things can happen. One, there are people that I would say who are other blacks that are suffering silently. And so when you use your voice, you help others find their voice. And it's so important. There are others in the majority who don't know how to enter into the conversations because race, again, is that one of those third rails in our culture. So I think that's one component of it. But the other component of it is in being authentic, we find our own voice and we're more and more effective. And so I felt a need to share that because what I like to say is we need to be able to hear with our head and our heart. And that second part of it is often what's missing. And I really feel like while we're at this moment and we have more dialogue, we've only begun to hear. And if we think about, we're going to talk about real actions, but I'll end with saying the first action we have to take is that first action, to be able to listen deeply, even when it's uncomfortable. And that's why it's felt so important to me to be able to do that and articulate those things publicly.
Caroline, you came to Essence this summer as Chief Growth Officer and then soon became interim CEO. When you are a new CEO, the leader of the company, how important is it to share personal stories, share a bit about your experience, to bring the team together, to perhaps grow and to address some of these issues as a company? How important is it to you to share?
Here's what I would say. I would say that it's actually not a matter of importance. It's actually foundational to being a good leader in this day and age. We know that the corporate environment and other work environments have gone through many seasons where sometimes there were things that got talked about at work and didn't get talked about at work. There was things people knew about your work self that they didn't know about your personal self. And what I would argue is that time has passed. People just haven't caught up to it. We don't exist in a world where from 9 to 5, I'm dealing with this, and then from 5 to 9, I'm dealing with this. My experiences are happening together everywhere that I go. And so in order to lead as a CEO that is not only saying that who you are, what you do, and how you contribute to this organization is important, we also have to model that. And so for me, my general leadership philosophy is, this is who I am. This is the totality of who Caroline is. I don't share it with you to overshare or make you uncomfortable, but I do share it first so that I'm demonstrating the vulnerability and composure and mosaic of who I am so that you feel like there's no part of you that can't also exist in this workplace. And so we have to take the first step. Telling the story of who you are should come as a part of as important as telling the strategy of the business that you're running. Because at the end of the day, you have to create followership with the teams that you're with. You have to model what you're saying you want them to experience, and you have to be willing to go first. And you cannot, on one hand, talk about authenticity and wanting to have inclusion and wanting to have representation within your group and wanting to diversify and serve your consumer, and then people only know you to be the CEO that shows up at team meetings. They have no idea what the rest of your life looks like, both what you live with that they see, but also what you live with that they don't see, so that they can find a connection point with you. And that connection point is highly likely when we tell our total stories, because somewhere in there, then somebody finds you. And one of my practices as a leader that I do every time I have a new team or every time I have a new opportunity is I have about 20 slides that I share about myself that I call my dimensions of difference. And they're everything from who I am and where I was born and what my family looks like to living with diabetes and depression and being a D+ Christian. The reason why those 20 slides are really important, and I share them before I ask people to share anything with me, is because all parts of that are going to show up at work. And what I will tell you really honestly is it's too heavy a bag to carry to hide those things. I'd rather tell them to you, then we can decide how to get along. I also have a list of questions that I send to any team that I work with newly that is all about who you are. Very few of those questions are work questions. I ask you about what's your best day in your life, your worst day in your life, your hero, your shero. And what I tell people is, I'm sending this list to you. Pick 5 questions you want to ask me, and I will answer whatever 5 questions you want. You answer, I'll answer. And again, I think the criticality of telling our stories and doing those things is about us demonstrating the vulnerability first, the risk first, the exposure first. Nobody's going to believe it if they don't see you doing it. And you're going to probably do it 10, 15, 20 times earlier than your team will, but they will pay it forward by trusting you because you've taken the risk of telling everything that you are, good, bad, ugly, and they invest in you because they feel like they can do that too. It's foundational to being a leader in this day and age. You're not going to create diversity and inclusion in your organization if you aren't ready to tell all the parts of who you are.
Yeah, tell all the parts of who you are and listen to the parts that are different than what you are on your team. Create a team, particularly in the C-suite, that has views that are different than yours, with people that look different than you do. That is also critical. And that is something, Arnold, that when you came to Carnival as CEO 7 years ago, you made it a priority. You said it's the diversity of thinking that you wanted to focus on, but what you also did was change the face of the C-suite. Can you talk a little bit about what you did then and what you're continuing to do to facilitate that idea of diversity of thinking?
Yeah, so first of all, communities thrive in a capitalistic society. When businesses thrive, all you have to do is look at any community where businesses have failed, and you see it impacts everything, the quality of education, recreation, arts, everything in that community. And so communities thrive over time as businesses thrive over time. And businesses thrive over time through innovation. You have to, introduce new products or refine your processes so you can be more cost effective. You have to innovate for a business to sustain success over time. If you don't innovate, you get gobbled up or you go out of business, and you have to be innovating. Innovation, by definition, is diversity of thinking, is thinking out of the box. And so you're far more likely to engineer sustained innovation if you've engineered diversity of thinking in your organization. And diversity of thinking is often reflected by the diversity of the people. And so you need diverse people in any organization. It is the right thing to do, as one of the previous people said on the videos, but it's absolutely a business imperative. And that's what causes businesses to thrive over time. And so every job I've been in with any kind of a senior leadership role, I have purposefully, intentionally engineered diversity into the team. So when I came to Carnival, a lot of people would say, well, you bring your own team and so on. I didn't, because the reality is we have 9 world-leading cruise line brands. The company was doing fine. It could do a lot better, which we ultimately did. So we kept a lot of the people that were there. I kept them all. But I seeded in diverse talent, different ways of thinking. And that was gender talent, even educational talent. I purposefully brought in a leader who did not have a college degree, but had been wildly successful in life and producing, great results. But I also brought in, African Americans. We have a global business. A lot of our business is outside the United States. And I made certain that I had leaders. I had one who was born in communist East Germany, and so that's a whole different way of thinking. And so you just purposely engineer into your leadership ranks diversity. And you do start at the top. I'm totally supportive of all the efforts for pipeline and stuff, absolutely. But if you start at the top, those people, number one, bring other people with them over time. And number two, they create a condition for aspiration where people believe they can aspire and achieve it as well. And number three, they kind of socialize the concept of inclusion with their peers. And so that's what it is. So absolutely, we brought in a number of people, and we've been very successful with it.
Arnold, it's key also to make sure that you're doing that within the executive team and within the C-suite. But there's some who've said that maybe starting with the board is where it needs to begin. Make sure that the board has at least 1 black person on it, 2 black people, a number of people of color, a number of women. Chandran, we've talked about this. You say, no, it has to start at the C-suite. It's imperative that it starts there with the executive leadership team. And as the only one at Northern Trust, tell me why that's so important.
Yeah, so one of the things, first of all, I'll say I have the privilege of the progress we've made. We actually have 2 African Americans on our executive management team for the firm. The distinction you're referring to was being the first. But what I would say is this. The reason it's so important to me to focus on the management or the executive management team is not to disparage the importance of diversity at the board level. We need that. It's powerful. But it's because these are the individuals that are day-to-day making the decisions that are going to, A, set the pace of the culture and really drive the organization. And so the word inclusion was used a couple of times. That's a powerful word. It's also a comfortable word, right? We could really substitute a word to say receptive. And our practical reality is that our organizations today are not as receptive to diversity on all of the different levels as we'd like them to be. And so the key role that your CEO and your executive management team plays first is actually by using dialogue to shape the culture, doing that intentionally. So there is a receptivity of all the aspects of diversity that we think about. It's driving the measurement and actually making diversity one of the most important goals, because that's going to be a powerful tool. It's how you hold people accountable in the organization. And while boards create that accountability at a broad level for the CEO and the management team, it's the management team on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, they're modeling the behaviors that need to be shown in the organization and affirming behaviors. And then they can push that also out into the connected communities for the partners or the employees within an organization.
Caroline, I have one quick question for you, and it maybe have a broader answer, but there's a lot of focus on making charitable contributions. Many corporations, many CEOs talking about we're going to support racial and social justice by investing or contributing to this charitable cause or that charitable cause. But at Essence, you all are doing something different, creating your own public-private partnership. Can you talk a bit about that and why you think that may be one way for the path forward in terms of helping social justice from the corporate perspective?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the Essence Unstoppable Collective. What I'll say as I go into that conversation is I think what's really critical to understand is we're not saying that charitable contributions are bad. We're not saying that those are not things that are needed for the organizations that need them to be able to function. We're just saying that if that's all you're doing, you don't get brownie points for that. That's table stakes. That should have been a part of your strategy. That should have been where you were already investing and helping Black-focused organizations continue to be successful in what they're doing. So thank you for the check, but that was already supposed to be done. What we're arguing through the lens of what we're trying to do with the Essence Unstoppable Collective is what does it look like to create sustained change, addressing racial injustices through economic parity, through health equity, through education equality, and equal justice. And a lot of times as corporations, we cut the check so that we are one step removed from being able to go in and get the work done, because if something goes wrong, we don't want to get any dirt on us. The reality is you're not going to be able to create sustainable change if you're not willing to go outside and get your feet dirty in all of the places you need to be able to drive the systemic change that we're already behind on for Black people. So the Essence Unstoppable Collective is a $100 million public-private NGO equity and justice benefit initiative that we are focused on for sustainable change, right? We are looking through this through the lens of unprecedented city, corporate, and nonprofit partners. We have public donations. The collective is raising funds guided by our PACE approach around purpose, access, capital, and expertise to customize impact programs in local communities across the state that create sustainable solutions for Black and brown communities. Now, here's what's interesting. A lot of times, those are the kinds of things that an organization will partner with another organization to go get. What we know to be true based on the state of Black America is that when we partner with others, we get the least out of it. No matter what happens, we get the least out of it. So instead of looking for the partner who's going to do that for that, we created our own equity initiative focused on looking at that three-part partnership to be able to deliver sustainable change direct to community with all of the areas that need to be touched, not just the charitable areas. And so if you are not within what you're doing as an organization focused on the economic inclusion and the human right of being able to have that, then you're not going to be able to move things forward. You'll just catch up with where you're behind. And so we know that the business sector can't solve these problems and societal issues on our own, but it was critical that we created a partnership to drive greater impact. We're in the undeniable moment where business leaders can create lasting and impactful change around equity and justice in our nation, but it must be done with authenticity, commitment, consistency, resource investment, and long-term vision. And if you are still as an organization counting the one organization you gave money to or the $1 million that you gave to a nonprofit, then you are in an outdated model for driving sustainable change for Black people, period, because we are 400 years behind getting that forward. And so the push on the Unstoppable Collective is to create a public-private NGO partnership that is actually making local, authentic change, impactful change on economic equity, health equity, and the other things that have continued to plague this nation for Black folks that have not been paid attention to at the right level. And although I am excited about the season that we're in, I will not give credit for where we are doing what we should have done. We've got to do more, faster, bigger, harder.
Absolutely. I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your focus on what needs to be done in the C-suite and what you are doing already and sharing that with us. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Chandran. Thank you, Arnold, for being with us today and for helping us set the path forward. We're now going to turn to some other prominent CEOs who told us how they think that their companies can affect change, what they need to do for a more diverse workforce. And here's what Merck CEO Ken Frazier and United Chairman Oscar Munoz had to say.
I think there's another subtle issue here, which is the issue around who has the right networks to move up into senior management or into boardrooms. LinkedIn did a study recently, and in that study they found that 80 to 85% of these positions are being filled through people's social networks. And so as long as we don't have African Americans and Latinos represented at the highest echelons of corporate America, both in management and also in the boardroom, it's unlikely that African Americans and Latinos who are coming through the system will be able to take advantage of those social networks. And I've been in boardrooms, and I know that we want to find a pool of qualified people, but often we ask the kinds of questions like, does anybody know this candidate? And do you think this candidate would be a good fit? So those kinds of relationship issues are critical. They become the networking issues that either include people or unintentionally exclude people. At Merck, we've tried to do a couple of things to make sure that we are actually having the right kinds of people on our board. The first one is to expand the pool of qualified candidates. And the second one, and this is important, is to ensure that there are no implicit or systemic barriers to getting the best talent. And by doing that, we've been able to have a board that is diverse in the sense that there are 3 African-American board of directors members, and our independent directors are 50% female. We've been able to find the kinds of people who are leaders in business, in science, and medicine.
A lot of our boards in America have a very firmly established, strong base of individuals with lots of experience. On the perimeter, with bringing in new people, we can take a chance. Someone took a chance on me when I was a young CFO a long, long time ago to have me join my first board. It was helpful. It was helpful with my perspective about my business and my relative demographic, but also on the fact that over the course of time, I've become a lot more experienced in that regard. And I know from our board's perspective, what we're looking for today is somebody, potentially sort of in that periphery of up and coming, if you will.
Well, before we get people of color on boards and in executive leadership, well, there have to be people of color in the workforce in general. So right now we're going to talk talent pipeline. We're going to explore how businesses can help open up opportunity and close the skills gap. Right now, I'm going to talk with Rashid Davis, who is the founding principal at P-Tech, and we'll be joined also by Ginny Rometty, executive chair of IBM. Great to see both of you. I've gotten to spend a little time with both of you over the past, goodness, it's been almost a year now, and getting to know what P-Tech is all about. Ginny, I understand you've got some news here, and so I want to start in conversation about that news connected to P-Tech, which for those who don't know, it's a school where young people can get a high school education and an associate's degree at the same time, combined with practical work experience in a technical field that really prepares them to enter the technology workforce. And IBM has been working not just with one school, but on scaling up multiple P-Tech experiences. What do you have to update us, Ginny, on this move that you've been making over, goodness, the past 10 years?
Yes, well, P-Tech, Pathway to Technology, Early College, High School. I know that sounds like a mouthful. That's why I abbreviated to P-Tech. And Rashid there, my partner here, was our very first founding principal. And the news is that, as you said, John, we've been working on this over a decade now. And we were at 220 schools around the world, a pipeline of about 150,000 kids. But we now, in that 220, we're taking the number of U.S. schools, doubling them. So we'll be at 300 schools around the world, double the number in the United States. And it'll be a pipeline of then 250,000 kids coming through these schools. So the news is that we are doubling the P-Tech schools in the United States. They'll go from 127 to, in a total number, doubling themselves there.
Now, this, to me, is so important because there's this tension between people want to see an equality of outcome. But, largely in a capitalist system, we don't guarantee that. But we really can focus on equality of opportunity. And there's so many pieces built into this of not just gaining knowledge, but gaining experience in a workplace, making connections with people. Tell me what results, as executive chair now of IBM, having been a CEO, a business leader, what kinds of results you've seen from the young people who have moved through this program?
Yeah, yes, it's great because now we've been at it a long enough period of time. We've got real evidence, and Rashid will talk about his students too. But go back 10 years ago when we started this particular effort. And at that time, unemployment was 10%, and there was still almost 1 million IT jobs open. So there was this disconnect that I was hiring, but I couldn't find people with those skills out of the school system. So this disconnect between business and education. So I believe a major answer, and to this day, in fact, particularly now in this moment, is that public-private partnership. So business to work with government, work with education to build a new model together. So the results, because it's a formula that's been honed. It's 6 years or less. Think of it as your 4-year high school, 2-year associate time frame, but you can get through as fast as you can move yourself. But the formula is not just a certificate going to school. And that, John, is your point. It's my mentors. So the IBM employees are mentors. We now have 600 other companies around the world that are their employees are mentors. Second is you get an internship, so you get real experience. And the third, if we have openings, you get a chance at a job. And that changes everything. Yeah. I mean, our experience today, it's really interesting, of 3 to 4x the graduation rate of what would be a community college. And even then, we always thought we'd get these kids, they'd start with us, they'd have an associate degree, so certain jobs. But what we're finding is 75% have gone on now and gotten their 4-year degree. When you're a look around and you're with others that are doing that, their zip code did not determine their destiny. They had aptitude, right? And so this is one way to really bring that to the kids.
Now, Rashid, it's easy to think of this as a technology story, but I don't think of this as just a technology story. You worked on this coming out of the financial crisis, putting this program together. I can tell you that as a journalist, I benefited from something like this, a program where with a newspaper company no longer existent, right out of high school, had internships, training opportunity, practical work that really fed me into the workforce. So tell me, what is it about what you saw before this program started and you worked to build this program and what you're seeing after that you think even companies outside of the technology industry might find inspiration in and what they can help communities to build?
Sure, John. The disconnect between high school, college, and industry is what I saw beforehand. And what I have seen now in PTech is actually the investment of industry hiring a liaison to be on site, the investment of the community college also hiring a liaison to be on site, so that way their thought leadership helps to disrupt the traditional operation of school. And so therefore, when you have industry and community college involvement with faculty and staff, with students and parents from day one, then the students can actually see them as part of the culture that you're trying to create. So their aspirations for wanting to start college early, for wanting to learn more about industry early, really takes place and actually happens. And so the beauty of PTech really is a disruption of the day-to-day operations by having the commitment from both industry and college of having people on the ground who are really trying to make this pipeline a reality for students.
Rashid, how much of what PTech is doing that's succeeding is about the skills? How much of it is about the work experience and sort of the corporate culture exposure that at the same time informs the education?
I think really what it's really about access and opportunity, so that way you can create aspiration. So when students in 9th grade, they first come into high school, they get to interact with IBM mentors. They get to do job site visits at an IBM location. They get to go to a college very early on. And so actually hearing about it, giving them the physical opportunity to be in the space, giving them the opportunity to have a curriculum that talks about academic rigor and completing high school to be prepared for college. All of the intersections of high school, college, and industry actually matters to put students on a pathway to rethink what's possible for their future.
Rashid, is there any reason a pharmaceutical company, a media communications company, a marketing firm couldn't do a version of this? And if they were to do it, what would you recommend the first steps be?
Every industry that exists needs to do it. First and foremost, it's how do you make sure the types of jobs for the future can actually be not only sustainable, but exist. And then partnering with a community college that will help give you the 2-year degree and doing that linkage so that way the students could have that pathway. The beauty of that pathway of knowing what college you're going to attend, because you're starting it as early as your 10th grade year, takes a lot of the anxiety that many students have about not only attending and applying college, but even actually after being accepted and making that summer transition to college. So all of the early intervention from the industries involved in the early college piece is incredibly important. And so we're not just talking about technology, but pharmaceuticals, media, even education and civil servants opportunities really could benefit from the early pipeline.
I want to bring Ginny back in. Ginny, you, as you mentioned, as we both mentioned, have 10 years of experience now working with Rashid, now scaling this to a certain point, and now getting ready to scale it further. What has been the most challenging part, Ginny, about this journey, and particularly the getting started and getting momentum part?
Yes. So 2 answers to that question. One is that you've got to, on the education side, start with someone who believes. And you just saw that in Rashid, a leader of a school who believes in this, that if the child has exposure to other things, they've got great potential. So he was open and willing to change a curriculum. And behind him, I have to say, what we found is you have to go to a state where the governor supports this. So you'll notice we're in 11 states now. We'll be going into more. Every single one of those cases, whether it's Texas to Rhode Island to New York, those governors are extremely involved. They believe in this. They put a little bit of money. It's not a lot behind this program to get and grease the wheels to get it going. So you need a committed governor and a committed leader of a school. And mind you, we've gone to all underserved
Now tell me more about that. Tell me more about that governor part, because that's a very high level in the state to need buy-in for. Why in particular? What are either the barriers that get removed, or the speed at which things happen when you have governor buy-in specifically? Well,
think about it. In many of the schools, you're getting your associate degree and you're getting it at no cost. So the state's thinking, and honestly, when they look at the trade-off of employment, unemployment, and if a child can go from school, get a job, a young person, that economically, mathematically is actually better for them to do this and to then have them complete their associate degree. So at a governor level, they're going to think through those trade-offs and say, yes, this is a really good decision. I should give them that associate degree at no cost. And so we even have some states in our country that if you continue to move and go on through to an associate degree right from high school, the state will pick up that tab. So the students Rashid is speaking of in all these schools, they are getting their associate degree included as part of you want to think of it as your high school education. So that's a decision a state can make. And that's very important in their involvement, and they make the trade-offs. The other side, when you say, what about to scale? Oh, go ahead, John. Oh, the other side.
You were making me think of, go ahead, Rashid.
I think that also the dual enrollment laws that exist in every state is different. And so having the governor on board who could help with that legislative process so that way dual enrollment can begin as early as the 9th grade or the 10th grade really helps a program like PTech.
Mm. Yes, because to Rashid's
point. Rashid, to follow up just a moment on that, I want to know from you, there's so many companies that say, boy, we're looking for talent, we just can't find it, the pipeline is important. They're saying now, many companies are saying now, we're looking to historically black colleges and universities and relationships with them to find that talent. Where else, perhaps, should companies look? What would you suggest they do to start to get a more diverse pipeline, kind of playbook-wise?
I think you have to be true to, education is a local effort, and so you have to be true to the communities that you go into. And so you have to know how to connect with alumni of the high schools of the community in which you are trying to actually disrupt and change. And so that's why it's incredibly important that when you talk about this type of public-private partnership, you talk about really getting connected with the community so you understand how that economic development actually positively changes the community. So you have to really come and be involved with workforce development initiatives and the community colleges that actually already have an existing relationship in the communities that you're trying to help grow.
John,
Ginny, you had a great point that you were finishing.
Yeah, I wanted to add a point. It's very much linked. It's the ending of, you said, what do you need to scale? It's the second point, but it's exactly linked to what Rashid just said. The other part is, if you remember no other word, remember the word pathways. As an employer, you have to open up the pathways to bring people in that may have gotten a skill and not through a 4-year degree. So as an example, we top to bottom went through every job posting and said, do you have to have a 4-year degree to get started? And today, 43% of our job positions do no longer require a 4-year bachelor degree to begin to come into IBM. So one of the things you have to break through is a paradigm that a company says, boy, if I hire people that are associate degree or have come through an apprentice program, I am watering down my workforce. That is absolutely factually not true. And I can prove it now with data because we see their success rate, what happens over time. But there are a lot of paradigms in the ways that things that people believe that you have to bust through. So this idea of a company has to open new pathways, of which it says, A, I will adjust my job requisitions, and to build an inclusive workforce, and particularly to increase Black, Latinx, you must do this because there is not enough time to wait. College degrees increases for the Black community has not gone up since, I want to say it's a number like 1969. It's a shocking number. So you've got to therefore say to yourself, I'm willing to therefore look at people who've got the aptitude and the ability to learn and bring them into my company. I can't be happier with the folks that we have brought in. But the two sides are work with the governor and then open the pathways in the company.
And Rashid, you're the one who started
you asked Ginny about
this.
tension.
I want to give you the final word. This is the final word from you on what people should take away from this as maybe they're looking to expand your legacy here.
I think it's important. Ginny has often said that growth and comfort cannot coexist. And so you have to be willing to challenge what you champion. When we started this work, we knew it was more than about just one school of having the opportunity. So it's about really how do we reach every state in the nation to really have that pipeline of high school, college, and industry really be accessible to students. And so the accessibility for students who walk into P-Tech Brooklyn to know from 9th grade they can interact with industry and interact with college is incredibly important. And the fact that we're talking about this still 10 years later and that commitment of the public-private partnership is still there is what everyone should take away from this, that this is hard work, but we can definitely make the growth of this hard work a reality for every state in the nation.
Well, Ginny, Rashid, thank you. What I take away from this is for everybody who has said we don't have a pipeline, you can build a pipeline if you put the time and effort in and draw the resources and get the buy-in. Thank you so much for sharing the story of IBM and P-Tech. Now, as we move on, we're going to talk more about the skills gap and narrowing it. Sharon Epperson took a look at another program aimed at exactly that.
Working in tech wasn't on Jossie Julian's radar when he was in high school.
It was a totally foreign concept to me. Through All-Star Code, really, I was really able to open my eyes to the power that tech had.
All-Star Code, a nonprofit educational organization, aims to get Black and Latino young men interested in tech by teaching them computer science.
I just found it super empowering to be able to take something from concept to a technically executed project.
Empowerment is the goal, since the most recent U.S. employment data shows Blacks and Latinos make up less than 15% of computer and information technology managers.
Providing access, providing an exposure, providing skills into the tech sector at the high school age is incredibly important.
Danny Rojas is executive director of All-Star Code, which went virtual this summer with 152 students. Mentoring innovative entrepreneurs is part of its mission.
We not only need to be consumers of technology, but we need to be creators of technology.
Having some coding skills is sort of like being dressed for success.
One of the few Black tech CEOs in the country, Rocket Lawyer's Charlie Moore, says these programs provide an on-ramp for many careers.
There's so many careers that are available now for somebody who is a computer scientist, that on-ramp can make you better as a lawyer or as a physician or medical researcher. You name it, you can be better if you've taken some computer science, if you've learned to code.
Thanks to this coding academy and its corporate sponsors, at 21, Jossie Julian is a Google software engineer.
The big takeaway there is that it's not really something that companies should be like opting into because of like a political trend or something like that. A company should really feel a sense of responsibility to bridge the gap.
Well, that is a great setup. We are going to now talk about how research has shown that teams that have a diversity of thought, experience, and skills just outperform other teams. So how can organizations develop the pipelines to create a more diverse workforce? We're going to explore that with Michael Heider, who is a Chief Diversity Officer at Korn Ferry. Bo-Young Lee is a Chief Diversity Officer at Uber. And Celeste Warren is Vice President, Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence Leader at Merck. Welcome to all of you. Celeste, I want to ask about your approach, because you're in the unique position of being a diversity and inclusion leader at a company with a black CEO. Has that, and particularly his focus on making progress in this area, made a difference for you?
Well, it definitely has made a difference for me as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Merck, having a CEO like Ken Frazier, who is very passionate about diversity, very passionate about inclusion, and also brings his life story into how he exudes that passion. He has accountability, and he demands that of his executive committee, his direct reports, the leaders of the organization. And through that leadership, we're working to drive accountability all the way through the management line so that we can make progress.
And Celeste, you have said that your approach to diversity in the organization really is focused on the bottom line, on making sure that value gets added to the organization through the pursuit of these goals. Why is that important to the long-term sustainability of these efforts?
Well, we absolutely have to make sure that our diversity and inclusion strategy is helping to drive our business strategy. We're in the business of saving and improving lives. And so if my diversity and inclusion strategy doesn't enable that, then we're just on the outside looking in at the business. So we want to make sure that diversity and inclusion that lens is there through our drug discovery, development, manufacturing, marketing, and commercial processes. And that involves making sure that we have diversity in our clinical trials, for example, in our research labs, making sure that we are leveraging diversity and inclusion in our marketing and our commercial strategies, because our patients are very diverse around the globe. And we have to make sure that our workforce reflects that diversity. Because I always tell our leaders, it's not enough that you have a group of people who are interpreting what they think our patients might need in many of our communities, but they have to have those employees in those communities in the room as they're putting together the strategies, so they can help us to understand what are some of the barriers and obstacles to patients in their communities being able to receive the ultimate health outcomes that we want them to have.
And Bo, at Uber, I see an interesting challenge potentially for you guys in that the contractors, the drivers, for example, on your platform tend to be a pretty diverse group of people. At the corporate level, the picture is probably quite a bit different. How do you both serve partners who are in a diverse community and make sure that that community has access to corporate opportunities and that corporate is receptive to diverse points of view and experiences?
Absolutely. And just like Celeste said, the importance of diversity and inclusion comes down to the people that we serve, our customers, our clients, and our driver partners and couriers as well. And we know that in order for us to build the best products, the products that meet the needs of our customers and our stakeholders, we need to have that perspective. So from the very beginning, listening to those communities has always been very important, asking them, not making the assumption that we know what they need, but asking them, going into the communities, seeing what their needs are. And actually, one of the things that not a lot of people know, but Uber has always actively sought to bring in that talent. Over the last few years, we've actually brought in several thousand of our driver partners in as full-time employees to help us, from a customer service perspective, but also from a product perspective and engineering perspective. So we want that point of view. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what diversity and inclusion is about. We know that our customer base is so diverse. We know that what safety means to them, what service means to them varies from person to person. And unless we have that point of view, we're just not going to create the best products.
And Bo, these are volatile times, especially for any business that involves people going out and moving around. You guys have had to do some significant cuts, or you have, whether you had to or not, I guess is not mine to judge. Where does diversity and inclusion come to play in there? Because as many of us have seen, oftentimes companies will talk about diversity and diversify when times are good, but then when times are bad, people of color disproportionately end up getting cut.
Yeah. So that was so important for us as we were going through a lot of our restructuring over the past spring. We really wanted to make sure that we were making business decisions with always the lens of equity through inclusion as well. And so all decisions were always done through that lens of equity. My team was heavily involved in it. And, because we didn't want through this period of time we've made so much progress as a company since 2017. We've made so many improvements from a representation of women, from people of color, and we didn't want this period of time to be a moment where we lost some of that momentum. And the really wonderful thing is that throughout all of this, diversity and inclusion has stayed front and center. I think you may have seen over the last few months, Uber has been making some pretty bold statements about becoming an anti-racist company. And we live and breathe that every single day. So even though it has been, a challenging period of time, not just for us, but for everyone, diversity and inclusion has actually helped lead some of the way that we've showed up. It has diversity and inclusion has allowed us to lead with a lot of empathy and care during this really difficult time.
Michael Heider, we've heard from a couple of companies about how they're looking at diversity and from very different perspectives. I wonder what you think about this moment that we're in and the way the country is focused on at least the brand of diversity. I'm not sure yet whether we're getting deeper into the substance of it, if real change in approach is going to happen. What do you see happening, and is it any different from previous moves or moments or notions that you've seen?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Relative to the moment, what is clearly happening is organizations are more conscious of the need to have this dialogue, and what feels different from years past is that there seems to be a genuine interest in wanting to think about solutions and outcomes as opposed to just merely identifying the issue. It is heightened to a great degree at the CEO and even at the board level. And I guess the curiosity of wanting to figure out how to make a measurable difference so that it is the outcomes are clear and expected versus it just being something that is an episode for the moment is what I see that's really fundamentally different than the way the discussions have been in the past.
Well, Michael, that's you said measurable, and that's my question to you next is about data. How important is data and a constant flow of data and identifying the right data for the organization to manage to really making sure that the right kinds of issues are being addressed, progress is being made, goals are being targeted?
Well, I think data is absolutely required, just as managing a business and its P&L is required, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is no exception. And organizations ought to have a clear sense of baseline information relative to hiring rates, promotion rates, exit rates for people by gender, by ethnicity, a sense of what their turnover processes are and ratios are. So I think what is really important, and I'm glad you asked that question, what's really important is data provides an opportunity to be more targeted from a solutions perspective versus just being all over the place, running in circles, wondering what's wrong with the picture that we're seeing. And data allows you to be able to measure effectively how you're doing against those specific objectives. So data is everything. And I think the thirst for that has increased dramatically in recent months.
So Celeste, at Merck, what have you found are some of the most important data points? I hear a lot about measuring the diversity of a candidate pool or people coming in the door, even at entry-level positions. I hear less about retention rates. I hear less about promotion rates. What do you think are both the most important data points and perhaps the most important data points that get overlooked?
Well, I think the bottom line is you want a workforce that is diverse and mirrors the in our case, patient base or your customer base or the labor force. And so the bottom line data is representation, and it's basically those numbers of how many of diverse groups that you have in your organization. So that's the basic one. That's the ultimate, the end where you're trying to achieve. But you have to measure it at the various different levels in the organization. So at your executive level, at the manager level, at the first line manager level, and at your professional levels as well. And then another thing that it gets overlooked that I think a lot of companies make the mistake of is you look at women and then you look at persons of color or underrepresented ethnic groups. And those usually are comprised of African Americans, Latino and Hispanic, Asian, and Indigenous or Native American. And instead of looking at the information together, you have to look at each of those groups separately. So disaggregate the data, look at what's happening in the Asian community, look at what's happening in your Latino and Hispanic community, look at what's happening in your African American community. What does the data tell you about entry, about promotions, about lateral moves, about development, and promotions? What does the data tell you about each of those different segments of the population? And then you have to put together strategies to really address each of those needs. Because looking at them all together, you could basically not be missing a very critical aspect of your diversity strategy.
Bo, does human resources tend to have the access to both the granular data in the right formats and the skill set to analyze it that would be required to do what Celeste is talking about?
Well, I think that's it's about the evolution of what human resources is, right? Certainly at Uber, we have both the access to and also the skill set to develop, to look at that data. And actually one of the recent analyses that my team actually ran is a large-scale regression-based model to actually identify not just the correlated metrics around diversity, representation, and development, but actually to identify some of the causal factors of career progression, about attrition in our organization. And it's simply about rethinking what human resources looks like. And also, of course, beyond human resources, looking at working with your data scientists, working with your economists, working with different parts of the organization, working with the engineering and technology groups, because the one thing I think people make a mistake is assuming that if your organization has a diversity and inclusion department, they own the whole entire strategy. They own the whole entire execution. But in fact, actually, the companies that are making the most progress, they actually have a relatively smaller D&I team. But what they do is they make D&I a part of everybody's responsibility. So it's not simply about Bo or the chief diversity officer driving it. It is about the CTO, it is about the head of your operations, the people who run the P&L. They're the ones. And so in Uber's approach, and I know this is true for many companies, we look at a very cross-functional, cross-collaborative way of driving diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, Michael, we say D&I and we refer to diversity and inclusion. It might as well stand for data and inquiry at a certain level, too. So I wonder if you are an HR leader who has not in the past had the capabilities to do the level of analysis that's going to be required to help the organization move forward, how do you make the ask for those resources? Or if you are a CEO and you recognize that your HR department does not have the capability to do what's needed to move the organization forward, how do you build that in so that you're not lacking from a data perspective?
Well, considering, the foundation behind the question, and I'm so glad to hear what Celeste and Bo are saying relative to how it's being approached in their organizations, it is a strategic imperative as opposed to a separate item. And diversity, inclusion, and human resources and talent management is a significant contributor to the execution of a strategy. The business case around how the data will help maximize the effectiveness of executing against the business strategy is the foundation behind the ask for an HR leader. And it's becoming even more of a recognition by CEOs as something to invest in order to be able to understand where the areas of opportunity are for intervention or area opportunities to leverage the same way that they employ the same energy and the same muscle in building their individual businesses. So I think the business case for that element of it is clearer now as a result of people wanting to be clear about what I call sustainable outcomes, but as connecting it directly to the strategic direction of the organization and how it will benefit the organization financially from a strategic perspective is the way to think about it. That increases the probability of being something that is added to the HR community if it doesn't exist already.
Yeah, new capabilities based on data seems like an important area to invest, particularly as we need to be efficient as possible coming out of this crisis period that we have been in. Thanks to all of you for the insights that you have shared, diversity leaders from across a spectrum of industries. Now, moving on, meaningful change often comes from the top, and for companies, that often means the board of directors. Earlier this week, I co-hosted the Path Forward Race and Opportunity in America, a special on CNBC, where I spoke with former Xerox CEO Ursula Burns on why she thinks there's a lack of diversity on so many corporate boards.
The criteria has been structured in such a way that you will not find a broad set of diverse candidates. For example, most board searches ask for sitting or past CEOs. And if you do that as a criteria, you can probably count on two hands the number of candidates that you'll get that are diverse, Black or Latino, Black or brown. So, but we also know that there are many, many board seats that are filled by people who are not past CEOs. We know that there's a lot of talent there that is needed on a board can be delivered by people other than past CEOs. So I think that it's a fallacy, and I think a structural form of racism and exclusion to say that the only people who can actually participate are people who have this very narrow set of skills. And it is a way to exclude people versus include people.
I wonder what you think about the moves in places like California to mandate a certain percentage of diverse board members. It goes to quotas, which used to be the red line, where virtually nobody in corporate America was in favor of quotas.
I think that quotas are the result of failure. It's a result when all else has failed. We've given you 25 years. We're 17 years into it. We've said push. It's a good idea. It's better for the company. It's better for it's fair. You name it. And literally, very, very little progress has been made. And what happens when that happens, people get frustrated and they start to mandate things. They start to put in place quotas. One of the things that I'm hoping that happens now, after George Floyd, with this awakening of companies that maybe there is a better way to do this, that this awakening results in the lack of need for quotas. But if we continue down the path that we're on, we'll be like California and like the UK, where you're going to have to mandate that people actually do something. Quotas don't work. Yeah, they seem to be working now in Europe, and they seem to be working now in California. I hope we don't have to get there, but it is a clear indication that you haven't been able to manage yourself. That's the way I interpret it. So when you haven't been able to manage yourself, we'll manage for you.
We've heard so many CEOs talking about inequality, pledging to make some changes in their workplace in terms of confronting and dealing with systemic racism. But are those just words? Are they being put into action? And how do you measure success? We have top leaders to speak with about this. Julie Sweet is the CEO of Accenture. Alex Liu is the managing partner and chairman of Kearney. And we have David Rawlinson, who is the CEO of Nielsen Global Connect. Thank you all for being here. You know, we just had a whole session about data, the importance of data, the importance of looking at data and measuring data. There's certainly been plenty of data out there that shows how important it is in terms of the business case and the financial benefit of having ethnic and cultural diversity in the workplace, how it will increase profitability. But yet, there still seems to be a struggle with some leaders in some companies of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. David Rawlinson, let me start with you. Are we being successful in making the case in the way that we're doing it? Should we be looking at other data, not just internal perhaps, but looking externally as to why this needs to be done?
Yeah, I don't think we've done a sufficient job of making the case, even though the data is available. We know that, for example, black consumers are about $1.4 trillion in purchasing power, and we know that that's going to $1.8 trillion in purchasing power, and we still haven't seen the numbers move really. We've had a black president. We've had lots of demonstrations that when the black community makes choices in terms of how they consume, they move the needle for companies. We've had companies really embrace the idea of diversity and inclusion and put into place chief diversity officers and D&I departments. But we're still looking at a world where the numbers on boards haven't moved. There are fewer black CEOs than there used to be. Black wealth is still a fraction of white wealth in this country. Black children are more than 3 times more likely to grow up in poverty than are white children. And so there's a persistent gap between what we know in the data, what companies should be acting upon, and the results we're able to see in the world, which suggests to me that somewhere the narrative isn't being fully told, and we're going to have to reshape, reform, and then tell a new narrative to be able to get people to totally buy in. I don't think it's working.
Yeah. Julie Sweet, you know, there are narratives out there that we may not be hearing, but there are initiatives out there that are being put into place that seem to also be missing the mark. They're trying to do better, but yet they're not. What is missing in many D&I initiatives today?
Well, you know, I think one of the most important things that we have found is missing, and that was really critical for the progress we've made, is to treat D&I as a business priority. So you just talked about the importance of data, but it's more than data, right? If something is important in business, you know, you have goals, you have accountable leaders, you have an execution plan, you measure progress. You set those goals and execution plan, you measure that progress around data. And it's, in some ways, it's incredibly simple. And yet what we've seen, and we've done a lot of research across different areas of diversity, is that a lot of times there's a commitment and there's a lot of things put in place, but there aren't the basics of what you would do for any other business priority. And, you know, we really have treated this at Accenture, and we have tons more to go, a long way to go. But we treated this as a business priority and becoming more inclusive and diverse back in 2014, where we really doubled down when we were trying to transform our company and really felt that the only way to do that was to become more diverse because we were trying to be innovation led. And, we think we're a perfect example of how diversity fuels business growth.
But how do you institute that rigor? You pointed out that many companies are not using the same tools that they use to evaluate other goals and other business imperatives when it comes to diversity. What is the rigor that needs to be in place for D&I initiatives, Julie?
Well, first of all, it starts with the CEO and making sure that when we set the goals, that we have the same rigor in terms of requiring goals, execution plan, and measure, and that you do that at the leadership table. The second thing is what you measure your leaders on. When I ask my leaders for their self-assessments, there are two things that every leader has to give me: their personal impact on inclusion and diversity, and their personal impact at clients. Sort of two critical things to our business success. I've been the CEO for a year. I took that from our prior CEO, who really led this doubling down back in 2014 when we first created digital and we wanted to really rotate our company. And it is really critical. So I start with those two things.
Alex, let me turn to you now to talk a little bit about if you've done those two things and you feel that you're doing well, catching up, making sure you're making progress. You say that still may not be enough for a leader to say, I'm catching up, look how far we've come, because it really needs to be a process where you're leapfrogging to the next level because we're so far behind. Can you explain why leapfrogging should be the way to think about this and not just catching up when it comes to D&I? Sorry, Alex, I don't have your audio there. I want to go to you, David, in talking a little bit about going into what Julie mentioned about she was following the prior CEO in terms of some of the initiatives she was putting in place in diversity when she became CEO a year ago. That iconic CEO, though, there are many out there that want to seem like they're the ones who came up with the idea, who are going to be the first and the best in advancing these initiatives or any initiatives, therefore, in the company. How much of a detriment is it to focus on an iconic CEO in advancing initiatives? How important is it to make it more of an inclusive endeavor at the very top levels?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. I've talked about the fallacy of the hero CEO, where we find a couple of great examples of CEOs who are acting powerfully on these topics. And if the CEO acts powerfully and makes it a top priority, the numbers will move. The question is, what happens when that CEO moves on? And how many other companies are going to be willing to follow that hero CEO so that it actually has a systemic effect? I am doubtful that simply having a few hero CEOs has the type of effects that we need. I think we need to use this moment when the pressure is still on and people are still listening. We need to use this moment to get on a different path where we see the difference that we aspire to. And I think the only way to get there is to do things that feel more sustainable, more systemic, and to put into place actions that go much deeper in the organization. It has to start from the top. It has to be enforced from the top. But ultimately, it has to be adopted and passionately believed by people throughout the organization. And for us, it really ties right back to leadership. At Nielsen, we know that we need great leaders, and great leaders can lead everyone. And if you're not showing that you're able to hire everyone, if you're not showing that you're able to manage everyone, if you're not showing that you're able to promote everyone, then that probably means you're not a great leader, and that may mean that you're not for us.
Exactly. Let me talk to you, Alex, now that we have you back here, in terms of the baby step approach, we're making progress, and the approach of leapfrogging ahead. Explain what you mean by that.
I mean, it's pretty clear we have to change the game. And I would point out maybe 4 imperatives or interventions that are needed to actually get to the change that we want. First intervention is the programs and solutions have to be Black specific. They can't be lost in the broader diversity and inclusion agenda for underrepresented minorities. These are all important, but you need fit for purpose solutions. So the best quote I heard is Ron Parker's, very elegant. What's Black about it? And if it's talent development, in our case, we have immersion programs and early outreach to folks that are just understanding what jobs are like, what consulting could be like. We have informal networking and boards of directors for mid-level Black executives. And we have offers for ventures and supplier development academies for that particular group. I have a reverse mentor who is a Black woman professional who's keeping me real time and regularly updated on what I can do to do better on the Black solutions and programs. So the first intervention is what's Black about it. The second intervention to get to the promised land is what's white about support. How white can the engagement, the allyship be? Because these programs for change won't happen if it's Black communities solving it with Black solutions. It has to be designed and accepted by the broader population in the workforce to get that workforce justice. I think what's important is in winning the hearts and minds, and we saw a lot of that over the last few months, is to actually operationalize that in encouraging, with the leadership mantle, real, raw, courageous conversations in the workplace. These can be externally facilitated, they can be self-moderated, they can be global. We had our South African colleagues talk about the outrage, criminality, and then the atonement and reconciliation of the apartheid examples. So having those conversations are really key. So linking the Black solutions with the broader outreach to the bigger bell curve within the organization. The other 2 interventions I think have been spoken about, I fully believe. You got to make it personal. It is about leadership commitment. People want authentic, real-time commitment. They want to know your belief system, how you got to be who you are. I think stories matter, and I've heard a number of very inspiring stories today and obviously in the last several months. I mean, obviously I'm an immigrant minority, and I grew up in the Deep South. My dad was a professor in HBCUs for 30, 40 years. Great universities, great students, great teachers, but underpaid, under-resourced. I've experienced all sorts of racial discrimination, conscious, unconscious bias, even in the Hallett halls of consulting, by the way. But I've also had great support, mentors, coaches, and teachers, mostly white males, by the way, also. And I've been racially profiled. I've had guns on me in California in this century. So the key is to actually be real, tell the stories, and indicate why your belief system is going to make sure this happens. And finally, I think Julie hit upon this very, very well. It's about embracing the targets and also having the right governance over the targets, because they need to be ambitious, they need to be holistic, they need to be smart. You've heard the acronym specific, measurable, accountable, relevant, and time-bound. It has to do all that, but you have to have the people that are saying, well, who decides those targets? We are a private partnership. We have elected board of directors, but the new chairman of our People Development and Compensation Committee is a female Black partner. She's going to hold me accountable. I want to embrace those targets, and believe me, I've known her for 20 years. If I don't deliver and the leadership team doesn't deliver, I'm going to get roasted, and I want to be roasted. I want to be held accountable. So I trust the next generation for this. I mean, it's not just a sprint because of the urgency, and it's not a marathon just because of the perseverance. It has to be a relay race. But I think these 4 interventions on tone, agenda, pace, and governance and the right ambitious targets will help overcome the problems that we had and get to a leapfrog status, hopefully.
Alex, that's a really good point. And when you're talking about measuring success, Julie, and you did lay out some very concrete steps to take, once you've done that, and measure it, who's accountable? Who is holding the CEO accountable, or who should be holding the CEO accountable to make sure that these measurements are meeting the targets that you've said that you want them to meet? Is it an outside organization that also works with you? Is it your board? Is it other leaders in the C-suite? Who holds you accountable?
There's a few different ways that we think are important. So first of all, our board is absolutely committed to our goals and inclusion and diversity, and they hold me accountable. And we have a board that is 36% diverse. We have 2 Black directors. This has been a focus for many, many years of our board. But second, and I think what's really important, both to hold accountable and also, as Alex said, to get the hearts and minds of people. And as David said, this can't be just a CEO. And that's about transparency. We have transparency both within Accenture and outside Accenture. In 2015, we became the first professional services company to publish all of our demographics around Blacks, and not together. It's Blacks, Latinx, veterans, persons with disabilities, and women, and it was at both the overall representation and the executive level. And we published that for two reasons. One, transparency builds trust, right? You will get people to come, even when your numbers aren't great. We didn't publish them because we had great numbers. We published them because we wanted people to believe that we were serious and that we were willing to hold ourselves accountable by publishing them externally. We've done the same thing when we decided, as David said, we need to take this as a moment for change. As we said, we were going to set external goals. We've been setting them internally to double our number of managing directors and increase by 60% our Blacks and Latinx employees by 2025. And we have made big progress since 2015, but it's still too slow. And by setting those goals and making them external, we're holding ourselves accountable. And I always say to the media, hold us accountable. Like, you know, when we are talking about this commitment, come back and see what we're doing. And the final thing I would just say is, you know, David and Alex and I have so many similarities in what we're saying and what we believe in. And so I would say if you're beginning on the journey or if you're farther along as well, is make sure that you don't reinvent the wheel. You know, Alex mentioned Ron Parker. He helped me in 2016 have our first conversation about race in the workplace. He was the CEO of the Executive Leadership Council. If you're starting, you'll see the ELC just published great, guide, a framework for CEOs who are really beginning on this journey. There are lots of organizations, and organizations like the ones, you know, you're talking to today, that we're willing to share and share what we're doing, because this is something that we can solve better together.
I was just going to add another point on the
Excellent. Dave, I have one quick question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I was going to say there's one other add-on, the metrics and transparency point. It's also important also to measure the employee engagement. Do they belong? Do they have a sense of inclusion? Do they see there's progress? And actually asking the bottom-up metrics. We do the same thing. There's external targets, there's internal measurements, and we publish those and we discuss them. We use them as a basis for Friday hall meetings or Monday meetings, et cetera, to talk about how you're feeling and why you feel that way. Just to add on to Julie's point.
That's another great point. David, a quick one to you as we wrap this up. People may say, we made the pronouncements in June. Give us some time. It's only September. What is the time frame? Is it too soon to be expecting that there are some changes that have already taken place and some of these initiatives have already been put into action? What should be the timetable for an organization? How do you determine that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's not too soon to have seen concrete action. Some things take time. If you're going to change the complexion of your workforce, you can't do that overnight. Obviously, that's a process that takes years, but you ought to be able to do things if you're committed, and even if you found new commitment, you ought to be able to do things relatively quickly. A few things we've done recently since I came on board, we signed the Black Leaders Network pledge. We signed the anti-racism pledge for CEOs. These are very public commitments to move the needle, and it's an agreement to hold ourselves accountable to outside organizations and to standards. And there's no reason why making those types of commitments need to take a lot of time. And then I think you need to have, whether it's at your boardroom, from your employees, with outside groups, as you travel along the path, you need to have multiple points of accountability to make sure that you're doing what you said that you're doing. It's easy to speak up with dramatic statements. Right now, the streets are on fire, people are protesting, the videos are on the internet. We're at this moment where people are feeling very deeply how important this is. The question is 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, when it's off the news, when the streets are quiet, when there are new news cycles and something else is urgent, are companies still doing the hard day-to-day work to make progress? And to make sure that that's happened, I think it's going to need to be a full-scale engagement, and everybody's going to have to participate.
Absolutely. And that's why the measurement, accountability, and absolutely transparency are so very important to make this happen. I want to thank all of you for joining us right now for this discussion. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, David. Moving on, we're going to look at what we are talking about in terms of systemic racism and what we are seeing in terms of findings from the Federal Reserve, from the Atlanta Fed. We spoke with Raphael Bostic, and these were his findings.
I would just say this is an incredibly important time to be having this conversation. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has really hit minority communities, both African-American and Latino communities, extremely hard. That's going to reduce the amount of employment we have, which is going to reduce the size of our economy, the vibrancy of our economy, and the ability of people to innovate and contribute fully. And what that will then translate into is a smaller economy, one that's less resilient, and one that will compete less effectively in this global world. So from a Fed perspective, this really is bread and butter, and I think it hits centrally to all that we need to worry about. And the last thing I would say on this is that we should also be trying to broaden our personal communities. Let's talk to people who may not be like us and engage. Even within businesses, oftentimes senior managers haven't had a lot of heart-to-heart conversations or just personal conversations with African-American employees, so they don't really appreciate all the things that they're going through. I think those personal connections and that personal level of understanding can make a huge difference in terms of shaping the types of policies that businesses have, the approaches that they have to develop people, and really, I think, can bring a staff and a team much closer together.
For all the advances that have been made by women in corporations, there is still data that reveals a very telling truth for Black women in corporate America. Black women are paid less and promoted less frequently than white male counterparts. Black women make 62 cents for every dollar that white men make on average. And for every 100 men who advance to a manager role, 58 Black women do, 80 white women, and 72 women in general. So right now we're going to hear from some women who were able to blaze trails and make advances in their own organizations, not just for themselves, but for other Black women in their industry and in corporate America. We're joined by Bonita Stewart, who is Vice President of Global Partnerships at Google, Erica Irish Brown, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Goldman Sachs, and we will soon hear from Monique Nelson as well. She is CEO and Chair of UWG, the longest-standing full-service multicultural advertising agency in the United States. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. This stark reality that we often hear, the 62 cents on the dollar that Black women make, the managerial roles that are largely much more going to white women than Black women. These are issues that we are all facing. But Bonita, I want to start with you. Some studies out there have said that many Black women are pushing themselves to prove themselves to superiors, to colleagues, without asking for support, without seeking feedback, without looking for advocacy. How important is it for us to be doing that and do it well and not seem weak when we do it? How important is it for us to do it, and how do we go about doing it?
Well, thank you, Sharon. First of all, it's very important. One of the things that we did, Jackie Adams and I co-authored a book, which is coming out next month. It's called A Blessing, Women of Color Teaming Up to Lead, Empower, and Thrive. And it's a foundation through data. And we studied over 4,005 women, desk workers, across all 4 races, Black, white, Asian, as well as Latinx. But we went across all 4 generations, so Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, as well as boomers. And one of the things what was so illuminating about this is the generational differences. And so I would say that in order to thrive, it's important for leaders to actually understand these nuances across the generations. And the younger generations, there's a greater expectation. They're mission-driven. They're seeking a place of belonging. So they are commanding more from the workplace. So I think this is actually a more strategic conversation if we elevate and start to look at the future of work, the future of talent, which is abundant, particularly in the Black community, as well as the future of leadership. So when you ask about how do you actually thrive, I think we're now in a new era where there needs to be a complete understanding and at the same time opening new avenues for the talent, because that will make the difference for leaders and for companies as well as in the boardroom.
That's a very good point about the generational differences and understanding that as Black women and Black leaders, how important it is to understand those generational differences as well. But Erica, there are also cultural differences when you're talking about a global company like Google, like Goldman Sachs, many companies where there needs to be a focus also on the cultural differences between Black workers. What is the reality for African women, for Afro-Caribbean women, for African-American, Black American women? Is there a difference there when we're talking about Black women, but when we're talking about the cultural differences as well as we speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion? What needs to be done there?
Yeah, I think there has to be a broad understanding of the experiences of Black people and people of difference around the globe. I think leaders have to be trained in inclusive leadership. I think they have to know their talent. You know, equity is not about just treating everybody the same. It's about knowing your talent, what drives them, their strengths and weaknesses, and bringing out the best in that talent. So, you know, leading across difference is not always easily accomplished, especially if you're not giving leaders the tool and the cultural fluency in order to do that. So one of the things in my role I try to do is make sure that we're giving leaders the tools to lead across difference. And that's how you get to support the fact that diverse teams are in fact higher performing teams. But, you know, like the research that Kathy Phillips did at Columbia University, the big caveat is that those teams have to be well managed. Otherwise, you have your homogenous teams actually being higher performing. So the more cultural competency that exists, especially around Black women, what they most want from work. There has been research done. Those are conversations that people have to be able to have with their teams so that they can bring out the best in those teams.
Monique, how do you have those conversations? I say you almost directly because I am sure your phone has been ringing. You've gotten countless emails from companies that don't have enough women who look like us on their leadership team, and they're calling you to say, what should I do next? How should I be starting this conversation? It's an uncomfortable conversation. I know we need to have it. Where do I begin? Has that been your role at all, particularly in the last few months? And if so, how have you executed that and facilitated that for your own organization and perhaps others?
Sure. Thank you so much. I mean, yes, it's now a time to lead with empathy. It's a time to listen and allow your team as well as your colleagues to let you know what they need. They will let you know that. So it's really a time to talk about inclusive leadership in a way that you've never done before. We've never been asked to reveal how we feel. That's been something we've been trained not to do. And in this moment, we absolutely are asking you to flex a muscle that you've never flexed before, which is that muscle of saying, you know what, I don't know how it feels to be a Black female in corporate America, and how do I do a better job of doing that work? And it's not easy, but it's also something that we know we're going to have to try and do more actively, right? If you start a workout, it's going to be sore in the early days, but as you do it more and more, it becomes, your muscle memory is there, it becomes easier. And ultimately, what we strive for is making sure that this is something that becomes a part of the DNA of the organizations that we work with.
And Benita, one of the key factors also is to not do it alone, to realize that you're not the only one, or try to make an effort for sure that you're not the only one or the one of two, and team up. You say teaming up is very critical here. What do you mean by that, and how do you go about doing that as a woman of color who is trying to advance in your company?
Yeah, so let me first say one of the things that we found in our study was the fact that 47 of Black women are frequently or always the only person of their race in a professional situation, and in contrast to 73% of white women rarely being the only person of their race. So the Black woman in many cases starts as the only. And there's a few things. When we talk about teaming up, it's teaming up across the sisterhood, because we do think, again, across the generations, there should be more generational alliances. You should know what you don't know, and the opportunity to actually team up. There's new members that are coming into the boardroom, new members that are coming into industries such as tech. We need to make sure that we're facilitating horizontally our own community. But at the same time, there is an absolute outreach for allies. It's something that we're doing at Google. When we think about mentors, sponsorship, there's programs across all of those. But now we're really thinking about allies. And allies also can team up. These are the individuals that are surrounding you in that environment when you are the only. So we need the allies to really think about hiring us, not as the only, but hiring us in multiples. There's no reason to have tokenism today, or no reason to say, I've done it one and I'm done. The opportunity is to really harness the talent and also look for potential. Look for potential in these individuals, provide them with the stretch assignments. But if we have just a plethora of allies along with the sisterhood in terms of teaming up ourselves as we start to multiply across many industries, it will be absolutely an imperative to ensure that the talent thrives. But we need both in terms of teaming up.
Yeah. Erica, there's been research that's shown that Black women are able to find mentors, people that will listen, give them a few minutes of their time to hear their story and talk to them about their aspirations. But finding that sponsor who's really going to advance your career when you're not around, when you're not in the meeting and you're not in the room, is more difficult. And then for some, finding that ally when they have thought of themselves as the only one or the one of just a few is even more difficult. So how at Goldman Sachs are you able to develop and present to people a mentor, a sponsor, an ally? How do you tell people to go out and find those people?
Sure. And I think every relationship is a two-way street. And part of being a leader is being a mentor, is being a coach, is being a sponsor, and using your privilege as a leader, let alone across different dimensions of diversity, using your privilege to help others. So those are three concepts that we do focus on at Goldman Sachs. I'll take a second to step back and make sure everybody is clear on the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And I will use the definition that one of my mentors, Carla Harris, gave me, which is that a mentor is somebody who knows the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are people that really they know you and they can give you the feedback and the tools and the counsel in order to do your role on a day-to-day basis. And a sponsor is somebody that knows the good, and the good. They are the people at the senior leadership table. They are the ones that are banging tables for you to have stretch assignments and opportunities and promotion and pay, and they can represent you well at the highest levels of the firm and provide the opportunities that we all want to succeed in the corporate world. So they are two very different roles. Sometimes a mentor can morph into a sponsor, but at the same time, you want them to be distinctly different. For us, a lot of the mentorship actually happens through our inclusion networks, and within our divisions, we do not have firm-wide mentorship programs. However, we do have firm-wide sponsorship programs where you have senior leaders, especially those who are involved in the inclusion and diversity committees, that are sponsoring our diverse colleagues for promotion into the managing director level of the firm. Right now, we are very focused on allyship, especially when it comes to Black racial equity. We certainly had an ally program for the LGBTQ+ population and champions for women, but we think in this current environment, Allies for Racial Equity is an important initiative for our firm, so we are rolling it out firm-wide. We have an ally guide and toolkit that we will be rolling out to make sure that people understand what the lived experiences are of Black people, that they understand the history and they have the tools to learn and not just have to rely on their Black colleagues to teach them, why systemic and institutional racism exists, but to really make them culturally competent, to be able to stand up for racial equity, take the struggles on as their own, and acknowledge that this conversation is not about them, but rather, advancing racial equity at the firm and transferring the benefits of their privilege to those who lack it. So all three of those concepts are really important and alive and well at Goldman Sachs. But the last thing I'll say is that you have to give people the tools in order to play those roles. You can't expect people to just know how to be a mentor, a sponsor, or an ally, without giving them the tools and the support to do that.
Monique, I wanted to ask you about allyship as a Black CEO. How do you find allyship, build that for your company, for your employees, but also build that in your industry? What are some of the tools that you go about using to facilitate allyship?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we have at the core of our business, for the last 51 years is the fact that, there is a DROI, and that is a diversity return on investment. We are looking at the next 30 years in the U.S., the 90% of the growth is going to come from 3 communities. That's African American, that's Latinx, and that's Asian. And if we don't really talk about making sure that that is inculcated in our cultures and a part of our strategies moving forward, we really are talking about leaving a great deal on the table, as well as not necessarily doing the right things for our business. So it's imperative that as we talk to our allies, we can talk about doing good as well as doing good in our businesses. It's really, really important that we frame this as this is a business. These are communities, and our health equals our wealth. And we have to make sure that that health is everywhere, in workplace safety, in our profitability, in our employee retention. It's something that is ubiquitous in our businesses, and we really do strive at Uniworld to ensure that it is part of the DNA, it's integrated into your businesses, it's integrated into how you innovate and produce products and make things happen in your organization. We all know that diversity absolutely brings the best ideas, and it also brings higher profitability, anywhere from 15% to 35% when you start to introduce true innovation throughout your organization, and it can deliver the ROI that we're looking for. And the last thing I'll say is, we all pay attention to what's happening to our PE ratios. And that is about whether or not your organization is set up for the long term. Are you future-proofed? And at this stage of the game, we really do need to look at D&I and inclusion as part of that equation moving forward.
Looking at it as part of the equation, of course, is essential. I'm thinking back of, the way that companies have evolved and what is important and the skills that are important to advance in the corporation. Of course, the IQ, the technical skills, the skills that you needed to just do that job function initially were most important. And then people start saying, well, soft skills are equally important, maybe even more so. You need to have that emotional intelligence. You need to be able to interact well with people. And now, Benita, a lot of folks are saying you need to have cultural intelligence. If you don't have that life experience, you need to at least know enough to be able to empathize with that life experience. How do you promote cultural intelligence in the workplace? What are some of the tools that you've used at Google or that you've talked about other companies using in your book?
Well, I would say yes. We do have an evolution that's going on right now. It started with IQ, then there was EQ, and now it is CQ. And quite frankly, the exemplary leaders of tomorrow will be those that are harnessing the cultural intelligence. And it starts with just having knowledge, base knowledge, as as Erica has talked about, as well as thinking about your overall mission. So at Google, we're building products for everyone. We want to be helpful for everyone. So it's a natural for us to make sure that we are training our leaders as well as anyone that has a responsibility for their teams. That's something I think about every single day, is how can I be a better leader for my team? And as we're building products, we're also looking at this moment because we do think where we are right now, that we can harness just the energy of the moment. And there's an opportunity for us to really build in meaningful and lasting change. But we can only do that if we start with the leaders first. And that comes through, one, knowledge, two, making sure that we have the right programs to accelerate the talent, to attract the talent. We've seen increases in that. We were the first one to actually release our diversity report. In fact, I was responsible for founding Howard West, where we looked at harnessing the talent really, again, from everywhere. So looking at the historically Black colleges, we've now expanded that to 10 plus colleges, but starts with knowledge, but it also starts with making sure that we are holding our leaders accountable and making sure that we're living up to our mission to build products and to be helpful to everyone.
Erica, of course, it starts at the top, as Benita said, and making sure that the leaders are doing this, but also how effective is it to have employee resource groups, business groups, affinity groups within the organization work together to build that cultural competency, that cultural intelligence, that CQ that Benita is talking about? What role do employees have in that regard in doing this?
Sure. I think our inclusion networks are an essential part of our global diversity and inclusion strategy. You must have that leadership from the top. I have to repeat that because the role model behavior that comes from the CEO, the C-suite, the board, and that commitment, that's how you can implement policies and practices and goals and metrics to drive diversity and inclusion from the top down. But you need the boots on the ground, and you need to be able to build culture through inclusion networks. So we have 19,000 people at Goldman Sachs that are involved in our inclusion networks, and we have them focused on key pillars, including recruiting, right? So, there are extra arms and legs on campuses, at events that are bringing people into the firm and representing the culture of the firm, which is extremely important to us. So, for our key pillars at the firm, inclusive culture is an important one.
Yes.
Besides the manager training, it is in fact our people in the networks that are driving culture at the firm.
Excellent. Well, all of these issues that we've talked about and the solutions that you've come up with are beneficial not just for Black women in corporate America, but for corporate America. And I appreciate all of you sharing your insights. Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to a story of an interview that was done on CNBC with Atlanta Hawks head coach Lloyd Pierce, talking about advancement training and how he got to where he is.
We need to see more Black leaders. We need to see more Black coaches. We need to see more Black financial advisors, whatever the case may be, because we are the example. It's hard to, I didn't grow up seeing a lot of Black coaches, so I never really thought about being a coach. And when the opportunity came, then I was able and naturally able to just move forward. I have to be the example for the young generation of Black men and Black women so they see that there are other things that they're capable of becoming.
I'm Andrew Sorkin. As we conclude today's forum, we want to have a conversation and try to look towards the future. And we want to do that with some bright young leaders who are planning and ushering in a very new era, and try to talk about the inclusion efforts at their organizations and what we can learn from them. Joining us this afternoon is Ryan Williams, co-founder and CEO of Cadre, a real estate and technology company. Jason Wright, president, of course, of the Washington football team, is with us. And Morgan DeBaun, founder and CEO of Blavity, the largest network of platforms and lifestyle brands serving Black audiences. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. I want to start with you, Morgan. You have a remarkable story. You launched your company 6 years ago, and you are one of the first of 15 American women to raise $1 million in venture funding or more. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who's leading a company and is now also an angel investor, what you think needs to be done to make capital more accessible, given that that seems to be such a key to this challenging issue.
Yeah, well, one, thank you for having me. You know, when it comes to raising money, I think it's an incredible feat at all to be able to raise and convince people at the early stages of your business to give you $1 million or more. In the past 6 years, I think the community within Silicon Valley, within our industry, has made significant strides, but there's a lot of work to do. So in terms of increasing access to capital, one, I think for the venture capitalists who may be watching this and who are considering diversifying their portfolio, you have to remember that a lot of young Black founders, we tend to look a little bit different than your typical pattern. And in Silicon Valley, people often engage in pattern matching. So myself, I'm from the Midwest. I don't have a technical degree. I didn't go to Stanford, and this is my first company, so I was a first-time founder. My pitches may have sound differently. So I think one is just understanding that own bias for wanting to match a pattern that you're used to seeing, and realizing and accepting that you may be a little uncomfortable, but this is actually how innovation is made, is when you go outside of the immediate opportunity and you really think about, wow, maybe because this young person is standing in front of me, despite the odds, this is a bet that I want to make. So that's my first suggestion. And then two, for those Black founders and entrepreneurs who are considering venture funding, I think really in making sure that they feel and they know that this is your time. There's never been a better time to raise money for your company. Everyone is looking to have diverse companies, portfolios, and to make sure that they're actually targeting diverse audiences as well when it comes to the market opportunity of the future of this country. So this is your time to shine, so go get after it.
Ryan, I want to ask you, you are disrupting the real estate industry, technology as well, but the real estate industry has long been an old boys network and dare I say, a very white industry. What led you to want to get into the business, given the the issues we're talking about, modeling and everything else. And you've, by the way, become a great role model for so many in the African American community now in real estate. But what led you to it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andrew, and appreciate you having me on. Look, I know firsthand what access to financial investments like real estate can do for somebody's future. I grew up working class. Nobody in my family had been involved with real estate, let alone tech and real estate. And I was fortunate to have people that believed in me and had some ways even greater expectations for myself than I did at the time, and said, think outside the box. One of the people being a guy I know you know well named Ray McGuire, who really took me under his wing my freshman year in college when I came in a little bit lost. And Ray was one of the people that said, why not financial services? Why not real estate? Look what I've been able to do. And the more time I spent in real estate, including starting my own business, buying homes in Atlanta in 08-09, one of the last sort of credit crisis that we had, I saw just how much wealth was being created. I saw what ownership of real estate could do for people's futures, how it literally could create stability. It could give people a fallback plan. Real estate's one of the most important asset classes to own to build that kind of wealth. But I also saw that in the black community and in lower income communities, there was a lack of real estate ownership. And so I set out to change that dynamic. I want to democratize the ability for people to build long-term wealth. I've never been shy about the fact that it's going to be a challenging undertaking, that I look different. But I think it was that unconventional approach and my unconventional outlook that actually let me, in many ways, beat the odds. And now I think as a result, more people are able to invest in real estate. And to Morgan's point, I think one of the bigger implications that's positive is more people see role models that look different, to your point. And I think that's going to create a cycle, the same way someone like Ray McGuire looked out for me and said, try to get into financial services, try to get into real estate. You're going to have to work 3, 4, 5 times as hard to succeed. I hope my example can catalyze that next generation, and I am optimistic about that, just given everything that we've seen to date.
It's an inspiring story. I want to talk a little bit more about it in just a moment, but I want to get to Jason. You are now the NFL's first black team president, and I should also say the youngest at age 38. Of course, you're working inside an organization that's trying to change the culture, the name, facing incredible challenges given the pandemic. I'm just curious what it's been like, and specifically culturally inside when it comes to the issue of diversity, what it's been like and the conversations you're having.
Yeah, thanks for having me, y'all. I'd have to say, if I had to characterize, where we're at, we're going to have to put our money where our mouth is around inclusion and diversity, and creating, a workplace that empowers, inspires, gives voice to everybody in the way that it needs to. And so, we are actually able to walk the walk in this moment. And even though it's been a bit of a tumult the last couple of weeks, it's been a time where I and my leadership team have been able to actually demonstrate how we're going to do things differently, enact policies right off the rip that create a more empowered, open and inclusive environment for women in particular, but that trickles down to everybody else as well. And so, it's a great moment to do that, as well as take a moment to think about how we build our leadership team going forward, because, and I think people have touched on this isn't just a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. Because if we have more diverse leadership teams, we make better decisions and we expand the value of our enterprises more rapidly. And that's what I'm here to do. And so it's absolutely something that we have to prioritize, both because of what the pressure that we are under in this moment, and I welcome it, along with our long-term strategic goals.
So take us, though, inside some of the conversations, because I have to imagine there have been challenging conversations. I can't imagine that everybody has bought in fully on moment one, that you have not had to persuade people down the field.
You'd be surprised, because a lot of people have worked in an environment where they felt muted for a long time. People are eager for change, and that also includes leadership. So, for example, one of the immediate things that I did even before I started was, look, how do we build a robust HR infrastructure and have the right employee relations processes that allow people to give voice
and surface the type of leadership that doesn't align with our values. Our ownership was on board, said, boom, do it, pay what it takes. Our leadership was on board, said, go for it, we're in and we're on board. I haven't met a single hindrance yet. Maybe I haven't bumped up on it yet, right? I've only been here 2.5 weeks. But I think there's a hunger for change here, and no debates so far.
I want to go back, if I could, to Morgan and try to understand, what does it look like inside your company? And maybe Ryan can speak to this as well in terms of the diversity mix, because one of the things we always talk about is if we can get enough diversity at the top, it will have a trickle-down effect. What's the mix look like?
Yeah, at Blavity, I'm empowered enough to be lucky to have a majority Black and majority woman-led company when it comes to our directors and above at the company, and all the way through. And I think that's really empowered me and the rest of the executive team to bring our full selves to the business, to really focus on how we can be a space, a platform, and a partner with other companies that want to have more inclusion and diversity. We've been able to, show up fully every single day in our own offices. And if there's challenges, we have an open dialogue and an open door policy to be able to work through things. I've certainly learned a lot in the last 6 years about myself and even the biases that I was raised with and the privileges that I've had growing up.
Ryan, I'm curious about fundraising in this environment, because a lot of this is about a network. It's about trying to create the right network and being able to find the right people. And I think that's been one of the great challenges as well. Those of us, including myself, and I have been privileged, very, very privileged, white privilege, and had access to various networks that I know so many people in the Black community and my Black friends haven't had. And so my question is, how do you think we can fix that?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's one of the elephants in every room. Is that social capital? It's the closed-end dynamics, associated with a lot of these networks. And I will say I've been encouraged by the number of white VCs, investors, leaders that have reached out to me, acknowledging that a lot don't even know where to get started. And what I say is that, action is a lot better than inaction, and it's okay to get connected to connectors. So, you might not be able to get directly to that pool of Black board members that you're looking for, or female board members that you're looking for, but I'm sure you know somebody who does have that network. And I think that what people can do is move forward, push the ball forward, get connected to networks. And now there's even more organizations that have been created and formulated, as effectively, beacons of social capital that more people now than ever can tap into. But I do think that it's important to get connected, and it can't just be about, we want to help with advice or guidance. There's got to be investment. There's got to be commitment. I've been fortunate in many ways to have people who believed and invested in me, but it wasn't easy. And I don't know how many people said no because I am African American. I don't know how many people said no because I was, a younger founder getting into two pretty stodgy Jurassic industries. But I do know that I've had to do a lot more explaining of who I am and what I'm about. And I'm hopeful, as Morgan had highlighted as well, that we start thinking differently about diversity. We start thinking about the competitive advantages it affords to have more perspectives at the table, because it's not just an imperative. It also allows you to ensure you don't miss your own blind spots as an organization right. and as leaders. And so I guess my biggest
Ryan,
piece of advice is if you don't know where to get started, get connected to connectors.
What's your board look like and the diversity inside your company right now?
Yeah, so our management team, our leadership team, and I'm really pleased about this. It's more than 50% people of color or women. And of course, we want to do better. And we know that we need to do more across the entire organization. We have a relatively small board. And so because I am on the board, I represent, more than a quarter of our board as African American. But as we grow our board, one of the key areas of focus for us is diversity across, other dimensions. We don't have any women members of the board, which we're going to change. Again, we're still a few people on our board today. But, we've started with our executive management team and making sure that, in those positions of influence and governance and power, we have multiple perspectives at the table. And I would just call out that by default, Cadre is a pretty diverse organization because we're bringing together people from the real estate space and people from the technology space. And we're bringing people who are kind of a little bit outside of the institutional norms. And so that's been baked into our culture from day one, is that we're going to have to look at things differently, and our team has to reflect that, as well as reflect the diversity of the client base that we're looking to serve over time.
I imagine all three of you are getting calls. Your phone, I imagine, might even be ringing off the hook, given the particular moment we're in and the number of public and private companies that, frankly, I think in good faith want to diversify their boards. And so I imagine you're getting these calls. What are you thinking when you get these calls? Because I've heard both very positive things about this, people who say we should be taking advantage of this moment. I hear other things from other people who say that they feel like they're being considered tokens. And I think there's more complexity to it than it necessarily appears on the surface. I'll make that a jump ball for all three of you who may want to jump in on that.
Yeah,
I'm happy to. Go ahead, Morgan, please.
For Blavity, we work, our core business is advertising with Fortune 100 companies who want to reach the Black consumer. And so we've been having these conversations with people now for years, but the conversation I think now has shifted from being at the middle manager level to the executive level. And so what we're seeing is that this has really opened the door for your directors and your middle managers who have been saying things for years and years to actually have the ear of those executives, C-level executives and board members, and that's resulting in bigger suggestions, campaigns, programs. Now, it's a multi-year, needs to be a multi-year commitment, right? It can't just be in 2020, this needs to be 5-year, 10-year commitment, because as we've talked about a lot, this is good for business. Diversity is good for business. And so while the conversations, the phone has been ringing quite a bit, I assume best intent. And I really challenge the executives and the C-level folks that I talk to on a regular basis to really not just tune in this moment, to make sure that there's regular checkpoints all the way through the business from the top all the way down, so things don't get lost in the trickle down, because I think that's where the biggest risk for execution risk is in the future.
Yeah, I'll build on what Morgan was saying by, if I were at home talking to y'all, I would say, get in where you fit in. I am not as caught up on the motives, whether someone is, looking for a token position, et cetera. If you're going to bring in an accomplished Black, brown, woman, LGBTQ plus professional onto your board, I'm not going to get caught up in the motive, but I am, as an individual of color or whatever aspects of my identity I'm bringing to the table, I'm going to communicate to that leadership team how I am going to be and how I expect my identity to show up in the way that I give voice to issues in the boardroom, in the way that I bring my thinking to the problems that the business is facing. In other words, I'm going to be unapologetically Black if I am on your board. So I actually don't mind about your motives, but you know what you're going to get if you bring me on. And I think then the partnership can work incredibly well.
Ryan, I heard from a little birdie that you were offered a board position recently and you turned it down.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to be contacted by a few folks about different board opportunities. And, I think that, number one, my focus is cadre and executing on our mission of, democratizing access to real estate. I'm also very focused on a couple of new products we have on the horizon that will be focused on not just delivering greater access, but driving positive societal change. And I don't want anything at this point in time to take away from that focus. But what's interesting is that in a couple of the cases where I've been contacted about board opportunities, while I turned them down just given my focus right now, I actually was able to connect, in both cases, those individuals to two other African Americans that I frankly thought could be even better qualified than me that weren't in those networks. And so that gets back to that point. And even if you don't know exactly how to tap directly into the pools of talent, there's someone who does. And I'm sure that in this digital world where connections are easier than ever, people can be resourceful and get connected in a way that's effective. But yeah, for me right now, Andrew, it's been just heads down focus on executing. We have a lot going on in the world right now, and I want to use my platform and Cadre's platform to help drive positive change. And as board opportunities down the line present themselves, I'll assess. But right now, Cadre is the #1 focus.
Fair enough. I got a couple more questions, and we're going to run out of time. And this conversation can go on for a very long time because I have so many questions. But Jason, I wanted to ask you about private sector versus public sector, in particular education. And the reason I ask it is so far our conversation's all been about what the private sector can do. But I think there's a large piece of this that ultimately is also going to be a partnership, if you will, with the public sector. And I think education is going to be a big element. If you could change the education system today, in particular around this issue of diversity, what would you do?
Wow, you just gave me a powerful magic wand right there. I'll defer to the expertise of some of my former clients in higher ed. And the way that I think higher ed has both led the way and has an opportunity to do even more on diversity and inclusion is to do it in an integrated fashion. I think institutions have done great with their student bodies. They have been able to find a way to find talent in pockets where it wasn't before. And programs that people may decry politically have actually worked quite well for institutions to build a student body that creates a robust academic experience through the lens of diversity. But it hasn't materialized into tenured professors. There's a gap there. And it hasn't flowed its way through curriculum. And I think the institutions and thinkers that are doing this best are saying diversity should be just how we do business across everything in an educational institution. There should be a lens through various different aspects of identity on the curriculum that students are learning. And there should be representative presence, not only in the student body, but in the faculty that are teaching them. In fact, in K through 12, there's a study, it's many years old now, but it says if you're a Black student and you have a Black teacher for even just one of your years in elementary school, you're something like 3 times more likely to go to college, something ridiculous like that. So there's a need to have role models and representation and instruction as well. And I think institutions, no matter what level, are thinking about it in an integrated fashion are the ones that are going to get it right and are going to get the outcomes that we want to see.
Okay, final question. This one is for all three of you, and I'll start back with Morgan since we began this conversation together at the outset. If we all got back together in 10 years from now, and we sat together, hopefully in person, by the way, rather than doing this in the remote fashion that we are during this pandemic, what do you think the realistic goals should be and can be? What should we be aspiring for? And what do you think is, and how far do you think we will get?
Wow, Andrew, what a great question. Let's see, in 10 years from now, my hope and vision and dream would be that we have accelerated so quickly that people would look back on our story, or even the intro that you said where, I've raised $1 million and one of the number can be counted of Black women who've raised a significant amount of money, that people would say, oh, that's so funny. Like, how odd were those people back then? That we would seem, our accomplishments would seem like everyday achievements that are not worthy of news. That would be the dream for me, that we've really pushed forward fast enough.
Jason, what do you think?
It is a hard question, and I think I can't say it much better than Morgan. Maybe I'll give just a quick insight on, I think, the things we can do to get there more quickly. I think we all need to think hard about how we tie the incentives that matter for individuals and organizations to those outcomes. Organizations that move the needle on this most swiftly and with the best effect are those that have said, hey, our leaders are going to be assessed on how they cultivate the pipeline of diverse talent coming through the company. And so I'd love to see that become the norm. However you reward within your organization performance, because this is a business imperative, we should reward those leaders who are the best at promoting and developing Black, Brown, Latinx women talent across our organizations. And I would love to see practices like that seem so bold today become a par for the course.
Can I just follow up on that? And I'm curious, in a very specific way about the goal. When I say the goal, some people believe that a company or an organization's diversity should be reflective of the community with which it exists. So, we could look at the diversity demographics in a city like New York or Washington or what have you, and that's the way an organization should look. Others think it should be beyond that. Others think it should be less. But so I'm curious there. But I'm also curious about the incentive, because the incentive is a very interesting one. Insofar as there are a number of big public companies now, Microsoft and Uber, that actually are providing compensation. They part of your bonus, in large part, if you're in the hiring business, is based on diversity goals. Do you think that's right? Because I'll also tell you, I've gotten people who have sent me emails during Squawk Box in the morning saying, Andrew, you're advocating for reverse discrimination.
I mean, I'll touch on it since I was just advocating for something like this. I'll say this. If you believe, as I do, that talent is equally distributed across all people of all types, then if you don't see representation that is equivalent to, pick your metric, population, whatever it is, talent, available talent, blah, 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 something is wrong. And there's no reverse anything. There are just objective barriers that exist, seen or unseen, if we are not seeing opportunities equally distributed, if we believe that talent is equally distributed. And if someone were to argue that talent is not equally distributed, that's a whole different question that's a lot more challenging to address.
Right. I agree with you 100%. Finally, Ryan, what do you think the real estate and technology worlds are going to look like in 10 years? Because, I'd say technology in particular has said a lot about how much they want to try. But when you look at the numbers, it has been slow would maybe be the polite word to use.
Yeah. Your first question about coming back 10 years from now and the kind of progress and we would like to see and what I see as success, I think it's really about economic equity. At the end of the day, one thing that I saw firsthand in 08-09 was the absolute devastation that subprime credit crisis had on communities across the country, but in particular, Black and Brown communities. And they were just beginning. Our communities were just beginning in many ways to recover, and COVID and the pandemic, have set a lot of those communities back. And I think the big concern I have is, as we look forward, are we really going to be able to narrow, this economic gap? I think the opportunity today, to be clear, is businesses have to realize that, unless they're intentional about, investing in communities, increasing diversity, democratizing access to economic opportunity, what's just happened and what's just been surfaced for so many people will rear its ugly head again. And I think in real estate and technology, those are two industries where real estate, one of the best ways to create long-term generational wealth, it's been pretty homogenous. Tech, one of the best ways to create pretty quick long-term multi-generational wealth. And I think they have to be held accountable. And that starts across the organization. We've got to operationalize diversity metrics. And, there should be KPIs and a scorecard, and it shouldn't be something that people question 10 years from now as a true business advantage. And so that's my hope in both those industries. It's my hope broadly. And I think this is an opportunity, again, for people to take a different perspective on what all of our responsibilities are, for the collective society.
Right. Ryan, Jason, Morgan, I want to thank all three of you. This is the end of this conversation, but I hope it really is just the beginning. I look forward to watching your progress and success, and I really do hope we can have this conversation 10 years from now, and a couple maybe in between, about what this world really looks like and hopefully where it's going to look like. So thank you. I'm going to send it back to Sharon and John.
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you. Thanks
Andrew.
to all of our speakers. Yeah, thanks to the audience that's been with us. And Sharon, yeah, I'm thinking back on the road that we've traveled for the past couple hours, and you know my word over the past few months has been opportunity, opportunity, opportunity.
Opportunity!
And opening that up to more people. Yes, that is opening that up to more people. And it takes work. You can't just react to it and, you know, who you let in the door, but how do you tie the data to your mission, go create the pipeline that you should into your organization and elevate the people who show promise, Sharon?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest takeaway I have is that you have to measure it. You can set out what you want to do, but you have to be able to measure it. That's where the data is so important. And you have to be accountable for reaching some targets that you set. And make sure you set targets that are going to leapfrog, that are going to take you forward, and be transparent when you make those targets and when you don't. That is going to be critical because that makes you honest and more empathetic in what you're doing. So whether or not, we talked a lot to CEOs about their personal stories and why they feel they have to be particularly authentic. Well, I think all companies and all CEOs need to be authentic when it comes to this issue. Talk about how you empathize or how you don't understand, and also how you're going to move the company forward. You know, John, we would not be able to do this if it wasn't for the Executive Leadership Council and the leadership of Crystal Ashby. And I hope that Crystal's there to bring her in a little bit to talk about what she thought were some of the biggest takeaways. Everybody pointed to what she started off saying at the top of this event, saying that it must begin at the C-suite. It must begin in the C-suite. And there are specific recommendations that ELC has put forth on how CEOs who are just getting started can do that. But what I found interesting, Crystal, was a lot of the CEOs were doing exactly what you've outlined in that document.
Sharon, yes, they were, and it was wonderful to hear, because it means that we actually had an impact and that they felt the support that we were trying to provide. You know, if you think about what did we learn today, we learned that there's a belief that this time is different. Between COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd, and what the impending activity in November can bring for us, that this time is different. But to your point, it does start with the CEO. And that's the most critical thing that everyone has to remember, because there is an ownership there that has to happen. You know, if you think about where would I want to be a year from now, having listened to this really robust conversation and having heard all of these amazing perspectives, I'd want to believe that our social norms would have changed, that we would be in a different position, that people's networks would be expanded so that they had more access and more opportunity, and people's aspirations were being realized. I would hope that we should have a greater amount of transparency on the landscape about where we are, and that we were having more robust conversations around, okay, what's next? What has to change now? We've made it to here. So the reality is, this conversation is a conversation that should be resurrected again and again and again, because that's how the change is going to happen.
That's exactly
Absolutely.
right. And that's what we're hoping
studies.
that everyone who is watching is believing also, right, John?
That's right. I love case studies even more than conversations. Like, tell me what you did, show me the data and the progress you made, and then we can talk about how you did it as well. Thank you once again to the Executive Leadership Council. Without them, we could not have done this. Now, for those of you who have been having this conversation once again with us, please stay in touch. You can find us online at cnbcevents.com. On Twitter, we are at CNBC Events. We're also on LinkedIn at CNBC Events. And we've got more full lineup of events this fall. We'd love for you to join us. You can get more information on those at cnbcevents.com. Meanwhile, content from today's program is going to be available on demand at cnbc.com/inclusion. Thank you, and take care.